Hello and welcome to our webinar on reframing expertise. We are Tony and Phil. I say we are, I'm Tony.
I'm Phil,
I'm
definitely.
Tony, and that's Phil over there. But we are Tony and Phil collectively. We thought it would be useful to, well, firstly, actually, we just wanted to blow our own trumpet a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Let's just, I do think,
We want to just blow the trumpet. We've just validated an MA in creative teaching and learning design with Arts University Bournemouth.
we have.
PGCert, PGDip, and an MA, and we are very excited about it. These things take a while to come to fruition, and it's been a really great journey. I'm really thankful to the AUB team for supporting us with that. But we're incredibly excited to bring it online. It's coming online in early 2025. And it builds on all the expertise that we've developed over our, not to say long because that makes it sound ancient, but our
Some of us are ancient.
careers in higher education. Let's just say that about the value of teaching and learning design broadly, because we're absolutely passionate about education, higher education, but increasingly about helping people explore this intersection between higher education and learning design. So we thought we'd take a few moments in today to obviously share the news about the course, but then provide some, I suppose, some useful thinking about ways into that, and just to sort of open this debate up about challenges currently facing the sector and who might be interested in this course. So, Phil, do you want to say, how excited are you about the course?
Yeah, well, I'm very excited because I think that it's going to help us sort of like express and crystallize some of the ideas that we've been having. I mean, Tony and I, you and I talk a lot all the time, and always doing these kind of run-ups towards learning design, and always moving in and out sort of semantically between, like, sometimes we talk about teaching and sometimes we talk about education, and then the word pedagogy gets bandied around, and then learning design, and sometimes it is, and yet I think this intersection, this sort of that course title, creative teaching and learning design, starts to feel like a sort of a drawing together of some of that sort of some of those semantics to sort of like say something sort of finally and sort of irreducibly about this world of people who are interested in creating experiences for educators and also experiences for learners, and sort of seeing the sliding doors between those two spaces, and sort of not seeing those activities as siloed, and also not seeing them as being siloed within formal educational institutions, and just trying to have a much more nuanced, encompassing conversation about the importance of learning and it being done effectively. And I think I just want to sort of like kick things off by literally just saying, just prior to this webinar starting, I was just talking to two people where I live who I met on the street, and they're both senior sort of lecturers, sort of in various art schools, and they were demob happy because it's August, hooray! But they're also filled with existential dread because they're convinced that they're about to be restructured, and they know they're going to be, and so they're looking into September, sort of that sort of that beginning of the new year, with trepidation, and I think a sense that a shrinking is taking place. There's kind of an extinction event going on. And if you look at all of the reports, and if you look at the sort of the mood music and the sort of the hostile environment that's been sort of generated around HE, there isn't a lot of people who aren't experiencing that shrink. And I just want to say this is that, so I've just passed my 5-year anniversary of leaving the sector. So I left in July 2019. And I left for reasons that people understand, and I must admit that when I left, because I've been doing my job for such a long time, I literally had this strange thing where I had all this experience, but I also felt incredibly de-skilled. HE had made me feel as if my usefulness was in a very small and limited space, and all the conversations in the institution, my value, my impact, my influence, my own powers had somehow been shrunk or sort of diminished or limited or boxed off. And I certainly realized that when I first left, I had a bit of a mindset issue and some self-esteem issues, really. And I'm not doing that in that kind of like, oh, woe is me. I just mean that when I left, I left with a particular identity in relationship to my subject specificity and to all these sorts of things. And certainly through my work with Ding and with you, and now working with this huge range of organizations, some who are traditional, some who are not, I'm feeling much more confident about where my skills live. And I think I'm very keen today that some of that confidence and that kind of reframing, that we can talk about some of that, not as kind of like some sort of hideous best practice, total positive, ignoring what's happening in the sector, but really just talking about the reality of what happens when you start to realize that you have got more in your toolbox than you could possibly imagine. And so, yeah, and I that is why I'm very keen to link the announcement of the course with telling the truth about what it's like perhaps to leave a sector or to feel orphaned by a sector and not represented anymore, and what that means around what that can mean around your ability to feel useful again for other sorts of clients and for other sorts of institutions. So that's one of the things I'm really keen for us to get into.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? Because I think both you and I have gone on that journey where we have had a career in higher education and then have left, and actually that it's, I would say, probably less usual to do that than to go the other way. Most people have a career in industries, different sectors, and then end up in education, and it is actually less common to go the other way. And much like you, I had that same experience when I left in 2021 about feeling like I'd invested a huge amount of time in being professional and learning a lot of stuff, and then didn't really know how to apply that, and definitely had several threshold moments quite soon after leaving where I found myself in situations where I was asked to draw on my expertise and I didn't really know what that was. And then I realized very quickly that I did have a lot of expertise about how to design a learning program and how to think about learners and how to construct an experience. And all of that was tacit. No one had ever mentioned the words learning design to me in my 15 years of working in higher education. I'd never even heard the term. It was all curriculum design or teaching or whatever. So I think, yeah, both you and I have had this journey over the last 4 years in terms of, well, what is this thing? What is at the intersection of, well, what is beyond teaching and what is learning design, and why we have this sort of intersection of creative teaching and learning design. So
I was going to say, you made me laugh then, because you talked about you used that euphemism, well, no, that technical term of, you had a few threshold moments. I think what you're really describing is like squeaky bum moments when really when you're suddenly
what is it?
You're talking about imposter syndrome.
Yeah, totally.
Really. And that moment when a job comes to you or a challenge comes to you and it's dressed in clothes that you do not recognize.
Yeah.
It's dressed, the questions, the language around it, the questions you have to answer, the clients, the stakeholders, all that stuff. You think, I've never, ever, ever encountered any of this before in my life. What the hell am I doing in this space? And then truthfully, you have a moment when you sort of, like, in a way, disrobe that fancy dress and you think, you know what? I think I've done this before. I think I've done this before. And I also think I've done this a lot. And I also think I've done this really, really well.
Yeah.
But the fancy dress was completely different. And that's been my experience of, like, saying yes to jobs and saying yes to environments that really I just think, really?
Yeah.
And then if you, with a little bit of confidence, you just go, oh, you look behind the curtain and think, it's another one of those jobs. And actually, I've been doing this my whole life. I've been doing this for 15 years. And I'm hoping that, in the webinar, we can just, like, demystify and sort of link some of the kind of the ordinary and the sort of those ubiquitous activities that perhaps all of us in HE have done. And then perhaps link that out to sort of like learning design, this kind of mysterious art, and hopefully sort of like close the gap a bit, really, for people, I think.
Yeah, I think so. So I think we'll get into some practical examples of this, and maybe I'll start just by sharing my own, the anecdote, which I can still remember. And I'd only left the sector sort of a couple of months, and was asked to review a program of work, and it was a level 5 course, so second year of higher education, and there were, I think, 8 15 credit modules in a row. And I looked at that, and because it had been given to me by someone this course was a validated course, and I looked at it and went, okay, well, someone's obviously made a conscious decision around that to do that thing. And through the conversation, it very quickly transpired that that it wasn't particularly intentional, and that they just put together this course because they thought that's what the course needed to be. And so we quickly got into a conversation around, well, how are you going to teach that? And what about the gaps in between each unit? And what happens if someone fails a unit? And you suddenly realize that all of that, well, I suddenly realized all that expertise you had that you didn't even think about because you were immersed in the world of higher education, and it was your environment, it was your world, but it wasn't a world that everyone necessarily knew. And so instantly I was able to add value and say, well, have you thought about what happens if this person fails here, and how are you going to span that over the summer break, or when are people going to get a bit of a rest, or and all of the things that the questions that I'd thought about around good learning experience suddenly were very useful. And it was at that moment I think the light bulb went on, and I went, oh, hang on, I can add value here. But about 10 minutes ago I felt completely out of my depth.
Yeah, I mean, I just, as you know, the first bit of consultancy work that I did when I first left, this is sort of like in the sort of the liminal running into ding, and that was for Amnesty International, and I was brought in as a communications consultant, and I literally had the strongest, most potent attack of imposter syndrome. I remember walking up to the Amnesty's offices in London, and every noise, every footstep was taking me more and more of an effort to take, because I was about to walk through this entrance as a communications consultant, and I just thought, well, I'm not one of those. What are you talking about? But anyway, I walked in, and when the actual problem that the communications consultant was being asked to solve was revealed, it was absolutely a learning problem, and it was a learning resource problem, and it was an onboarding problem, and it was like the learning materials that this organization has in existence are failing to involve people. There's a failure going on here. There's a misalignment. And I think, and I'm not talking about that light bulb came on day 2. In fact, the light bulb came on much, much later. But communications consultant was a red herring. It was a big learning design project, and therefore it was within my skills, my existing skill set. So it was like, why aren't these learners, i.e., why aren't these individuals able to access the information from this resource? In other words, why is this lecture failing? Why is this module not working? Why are people rejecting this particular brief? And you realise that actually you've been set up through my experience to be able to come at those from a learner's perspective. So not from the organization's perspective, not from the perspective of like a website or but from like the user, i.e. the learner, i.e. the human being who was trying to extract information from a resource. So I mean, I'm going to quickly say to you then, if I had to give you an example of the most mundane, innocuous, ubiquitous thing that I had to do as a course leader and as an educator, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to ask you to reframe it from a learning design point of view. All right. So I'm going to say this. I spent a lot of my time, as did my colleagues, producing slide decks, like PowerPoint presentations to accompany lectures, to accompany project briefings. There I am, worrying about the alignment of my text, worrying about the text to image ratio on screen. There I am worrying about the legibility and the effect of a PowerPoint presentation on a group of people. That's mundane, that's ubiquitous, but you put your learning design goggles on and you tell me what I was actually doing there. What was I actually worrying about? What was I actually considering?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a learning designer, I went through the same thing. Suddenly I was asked to produce a bunch of slide decks and not teach them. And that was such a weird experience. But then you suddenly realize that in producing these slide decks, you were sequencing a learning experience. You were identifying what needed to be learned at the end of that experience. So at the end of this lecture, wherever it is, this live session, 90 minutes, what are the outcomes? What do people need to leave with? And then what needs to happen within that slide deck? And if someone's going to teach this slide deck and they haven't made it, what instructions do they need in the lecture notes? Now, I'd never used the notes field in a PowerPoint before. And then suddenly you realize that actually that was really useful. If you were going to hand something over, you needed to make the learning visible. You need to talk and describe what needed to happen. So why is this here and why is it not there? And what happens when you've introduced this activity? What happens on the next slide? So the act of producing slide decks is bread and butter for learning designers.
Yeah.
We do this all the time, but it was never something that I had considered as separate from teaching. So it is a great example because you had to think about obviously sequencing, as I said, but also design, branding. Why does it look like this? Why not like this? You have to think about inclusivity in terms of if you're using images, why those images, and what message does that image send versus that image? Who's the intended audience? How old are they? And all of this suddenly fell out of this, like, make a slide deck. And you're like, oh, hang on, I've got a huge skill set here.
Yeah, I just don't say it in a weird way. When you actually were talking, I was seeing it sort of like the, that simple thing of slide decks, and slide decks are just a apparatus to produce an effect in human beings in a room that you are not in control of this time. You're sort of, so you have to think about the backstage and the front stage of your slide deck, don't you? You have to think about, it's basically a machine with a series of levers, and you have to move those levers around on behalf of somebody else. And I think that something is really as mundane as slide decks. You sort of realize that you are, if you're not thinking about the learner, and you're not thinking from a learning design point of view, you're probably building out really limited individual specific sort of resources, the value of which is questionable. So just that was something that even when I was working for Amnesty in that first time, I could feel myself drawing on this body of knowledge about how to create a resource that had to communicate without you, that had to sort of teach without you in the room. You were trying to imagine it in that three-dimensional way. So yeah, that's and I was sick to death of PowerPoint as a course leader, and as a lecturer. But actually, I was working a set of muscles all the time, learning design muscles, I think.
Well, let's go through a few more examples. Another thing that pretty much all academics or teachers in HE to do with timetabling. So you did an awful lot of timetabling in your time. Since you've shifted into learning design, what have you learned about that skill set? What was timetabling?
Timetabling. Wow, the timetabling project in my place. Wow, it was like loathed, and I think because it became synonymous with restriction and limitation. But really, I used to. The reason why I was so keen to do it was because actually you realize that you're producing an apparatus around sequencing. It's a three-dimensional game of chess, and the game of chess you're playing is around best fit of an activity to a location. So for me, timetabling, although it was a spreadsheet-based activity, and it was about room booking, and it was about all of that kind of stuff that was like death, on one level, what you were really doing was you were thinking about the alignment between the experience, the effect, the learner, and the space. And you can always, for goodness sake, you couldn't always produce those ideal conditions. But the guiding principles was not room bookings. The sort of the tensions and the conflicts that staff would feel, the frustrations. If you could sort of step out of those frustrations, what was really going on was a group of people who were trying to link their best practice of learning and location and effect and space together. So timetabling is, again, that weirdly meta expression of producing the most apposite mode for an activity of learning to take place. That was it, and that was in something as kind of as deathly apparently as timetabling. So yeah, again, it was one of those things that if you've done a lot of timetabling and you've worried a lot about it, and you've thought about it, and you've been thinking about preserving the learning experience. You've been thinking about people and their engagement with a whiteboard, or a member of staff, or the numbers of chairs in a room, that's the work that you've really been doing. And I think that's sort of a top level above meta learning design stuff, right?
Yeah, and there's another one. So we did something on this recently around the level 4 experience. Now, if you've worked in higher education for any length of time, at some point you would have been confronted with level 4 problems at level 4, students coming in from school and the first year experience and inductions and all of that, and it not going well, or what's actually going wrong and how do we fix it. But I mean, you obviously spend a lot of time as a course leader looking at NSS feedback. How has that experience, and sort of thinking about level 4, how have you brought that into learning design, or how has that informed your approach to learning design?
Well, I think the really interesting thing there, I think, is around the difference between being, I think, the difference between being reactive and being responsive, I suppose. Or so yes, with the NSS particularly, and I think a lot of sort of higher ed people are in a position where they see the NSS or metrics or those outputs, and they sort of have to sort of make things better, or they have to respond and put strategies in place and blah 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 blah. And for me, that experience has absolutely enshrined in my head the idea about alignment, and alignment is like a Willy Wonka golden ticket for me, because it unlocks everything. And I think that when you discover that sort of your NSS was poor, a lot of people are sort of convinced that the answers live in year 3, and sort of giving donuts to third years or whatever. But it was obvious to me that those metrics, those final metrics, were shining a light on level 4, on the first year experience, and that there was this massive misalignment between, hoping against hope that a group of young people were going to come out and like laud your course as extraordinary, when actually years 1 and years 2 had gone awry, or they weren't aligned. And so that refusal to tinker downriver, the NSS is to me so downriver from anything that's really important. It's like, how do you get upriver? And that is a design, that's a big design thing, right? Because for me, it was all about ensuring that sort of the experience from induction in year 1, year 1 produces year 2, year 2 produces the learning culture that produces year 3. For me, the big thing around that, the big insight, was to ask all of those really important questions when you're in a new with a new client or in a new space, in a new organization. And this is the consultants thing. I do loads of consultancy now, which is like, keep asking those questions, because you're trying to get up river.
Yeah.
It's like you're often brought in downriver. You're often engaged because of downriver, and you have to fight a lot and be confident as a learning designer to get up river, because otherwise what you tend to be doing is tinkering and sort of polishing something, and you're not really doing anything that's powerful. And I think we've had the opportunity, we've been lucky with some clients where we have started upriver, absolutely upriver, and getting those alignments right. That is absolutely what that NSS, all of that chat, all of that pressure, all of that conversation around metrics, all the nonsense about retention and attrition, all of that exhausting chat, I've sort of metabolized now, and it is around alignment. It's about, let me go upriver. If you're really worrying about that stuff, this stuff's really, we need to go upriver. And I think that's sort of like, from a learning design consultancy sort of space, they are some of the important conversations. I think a lot of our confidence to go upriver have come from the HE hand-wringing around the student experience, right? I really think that's where a lot of that kind of rocket fuel has come from.
Yeah, sort of comment in the chat there from Angelique. You said often saying some of the issues are around people who have PhDs but not a great interest in teaching, and we'll get to that in just a second around subject specificity. Yeah. But also you said frustration because it's all about following rules and business protocols that mean nothing to do with the learning process and experience. And I think, yeah, if you've worked in a university, often there are significant constraints, but that doesn't mean there aren't constraints outside of HE either. I think that the interesting thing here is, if you are making a move out of higher education and looking at what else you can do, one of the key things is to look at how you respond to those constraints, because all those constraints are often constraints on the learning experience. And so, as you said, the important thing is to keep asking, why can't I change that? Why does it have to be 10 weeks? Why does it have to be 16 weeks? Why does it have to take place in this room? Why is it 90 minutes long? All these things, and gradually you just start to sort of dismantle some of these structural barriers to a point where maybe you can't then dismantle them anymore, and you go, okay, it has to be this long because it's for these people in this scenario. If that is the box, then we can design into the box. But all of the things that people would have done in higher education around student feedback, like you say, course boards, limitations around technology, what they can and can't use, all of that is learning design bread and butter, isn't it?
Well, I want to say this as well, what you've just described there. I mean, one of the things that, one of the agonies, endless agonies in HE was you would just get your course and learning experience aligned, let's call it that, and then there'd be a new credit framework, or there would be a restructure, or there would be a business case, and suddenly everything was up for grabs.
Yeah.
I've built some muscles around that, because I am, if not, I wouldn't give my energies often to being angry. But the thing that would frustrate me would be when it was difficult to sometimes see the intentionality of those decisions and what it had to do with anything. But as soon as you could find the intentionality, as soon as you could sort of like find that logic, you could align things. And my experience of all my experience of the restructuring, I just think it's stakeholder management. I just think it's that you're not in control of everything. And then what are you going to do about it? And so Tony's absolutely right that you absolutely ask problematizing questions around historical doing. So we always do it like that. Well, why? And you have to have the courage, I think, to ask those questions. But you also have to have the wit and wisdom to know when you've met a wall and you've met a constraint, particularly a business constraint. And then your job as a designer begins, because you've got to then find a way to absolutely leverage that limitation to produce an interesting learning experience. So for example, if something is compressed, a great example of this, where things are compressed because the business model is that people are, apprentices have only got like this amount of time to do something, then you start looking at things like sprints, or you start using duration in interesting ways. You start to produce a learning experience that's not tragic because it's fast, it's exciting because it's fast. You start to interrogate duration. And I think that the problem I think with HE is that duration has been this fixed point for such a long time that we've sort of falsely equated longeurs and sort of like 8 weeks semesters. We've falsely equated some of that with effective learning design. And as soon as you leave the sector and you start to deal with other people, you realize that people don't have 3 years. They really don't have 3 years. And why is university 3 years anyway? And there's I think the learning design aspect of it's key, because it's about why, and then you align with the why. But that why has to be interrogated, right, Tony? It's not a fait accompli.
No, and I think there's another great, I was saying great is totally the wrong word, so I take that back. But another shared experience that everybody in higher education had was the pandemic. Now, if you were working in higher education during the pandemic, you will have been confronted with learning design challenges. They wouldn't have been called learning design, but they would have been called crisis management. Yeah, these students can't access this. They've got a phone, they've got a laptop. They're not turning their cameras on. I don't know where they are, but we've got to do these lectures. They can't access resources. How do we get them to do assessments when they can't make anything? How are they going to submit that work? All of that was learning design, and this is really at a macro level what produced the growth in learning design roles sort of through and post pandemic, because it really the pandemic really shone a light, as everyone knows, on the fact that there were a lot of practices in higher education that were historic, that hadn't really been driven by learning or students. They'd been driven about transmitting information to learners, which is one way of doing it, but they hadn't really been focused hugely on the student's experience or the learning experience. And so that pandemic just really showed that you couldn't just do what you did in a physical environment online, hence conversations around learning design. So if anyone watching is thinking about, well, what does this look like in practice? That is a good place to start. What decisions did you have to make around your students and your learning experience through the pandemic? How did you have to adapt? What did you have to redesign? What did you have to rethink? What were the challenges that confronted you around your students needing to get from here to get this degree, because they were many and varied challenges, but they were across the sector. If you're working in HE, you had to deal with those challenges. So yeah, that's often it is a rich source of experience to draw on if you're thinking about how you might have, or where you might find some of those skills within you.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably where you started to use that skill set.
And I'm going to say, this will probably take us a little bit, but this will probably overrun. Okay, so for those of you who've got an egg mayonnaise sandwich on the go, then totally go for it. But I think the big thing for me, the final sort of like thing for me around what it took for me to kind of feel more confident, having left feeling perhaps really experienced, but at the same time de-skilled. And I think that's a phenomenon that you see with people in HE. Loads of experience, and yet somehow at the same time feeling as if they've sort of been shrunk in some sense. And I'm absolutely, for all of my successes in HE, when I left, I felt that same way. I felt both big and small. I felt both viable and also unviable at the same time. I felt all of those things. And there was a piece in my brain, I think, that shifted. And the best way I can explain this, this is a slightly half-formed idea, so forgive me, but I'm very much reminded of what Hitchcock had to say about filmmaking, right? And he had the concept of the MacGuffin, and the MacGuffin for him was kind of like the briefcase with the bomb in it, or the microfilm, or kind of like the magical statue, or the Holy Grail. It was a plot device. And when you think about a film where all the characters are looking for the Holy Grail, you kind of think that the Holy Grail is what the film is about. The Holy Grail is really important. And, Indiana Jones and the Holy Grail. Oh, yeah, so it's about the Holy Grail. But actually, in that instance, it's a MacGuffin, because really all the Holy Grail is doing is making characters act around it in particular ways. So it's catalyzing other people. The MacGuffin is, in essence, not very important, or not as important as you thought, because the Holy Grail could have been the holy cauliflower. It could have been kind of the magic mushroom. It could have been like the bouncy castle of doom. It doesn't matter. What matters is how it's making other people react and feel. And I have started to think that my own subject specificity, so I like film, animation, storytelling, all of those things, I hold that expertise very close to my heart, and it's in everything that I do, agreed. But one of the reasons why I took a long time to feel confident in the learning design space was because I couldn't always find my subject specificity in the work that I was doing. And so because the work wasn't about animation, or it wasn't about that, I thought, well, I can't do that. I've got no expertise. And then I've started to realize that maybe my expertise and interest in film in this instance is a MacGuffin. It's a MacGuffin because actually what I was doing with my expertise in HE, yes, that was sort of in the mix, but I had to think about timetabling, sequencing information. I was doing all this metacognitive work around my expertise, and actually I spent more time in that metacognitive space thinking about my learners and thinking about how I could make them feel or do or want something. And actually I feel that perhaps my subject specificity, that it's not tragic to sort of say it's a MacGuffin. It's not a tragedy or a de-skilling to say, you know what, actually how vital and how viable and how important was that. It was really important in that context, but my experience and all the other stuff has become equally, if not more important in this learning design space. And so it didn't come right away, that idea. And I'm not suggesting that you have to surrender one to have the other. I'm just suggesting that for if you spend a lot of time being an expert, a lot of time being taken seriously in your specific field, to sort of let go of that, or to perhaps to think of it more as the MacGuffin, that can take some courage, because it can feel like you are letting something go. I now feel that that's not the case. I feel that I've got two things in my hands, really.
Yeah.
And in the learning design space, that all of that stuff you were doing to transmit your expertise in the most effective way for real human beings under usually very difficult circumstances, under imperfect circumstances, with stakeholders who were giving you limitations that that you were struggling with, then you have had a pretty muscular experience of being a learning designer. I would say, in addition to all the other stuff that you're brilliant at, I would say that you did all this other stuff really well as well.
Yeah, and that's a great way to round off the webinar. Really, is just to say that if you are, as you say, if you are working, or if you have worked in HE for a long time, then don't despair in many ways. If the future perhaps doesn't look as positive as it might at the moment, for all sorts of reasons around restructures, and then do take a moment to think about the things that you have been doing over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years that have involved learning, that are independent of your subject.
Yeah.
Because that is, you will have been doing those things. If you've been designing, delivering, teaching, assessing, you will have been involved in learning design. So you have a hidden skill set. And we've talked before about the hidden learning designer. And this goes just as much for people working in academic support roles. If you're working in quality assurance, if you're working in student support services, you're working in technology, learning and teaching, all of those areas are absolutely about learning design, because they're thinking about how people interact with information, how to sequence that information to get to a series of predetermined outcomes, what the experience looks like. So you have got that skill set. So don't despair. I think as you said, the key thing, or one of the key things, is it does take a bit of courage to let go of your subject specificity, and just the fact that you think of yourself as this person. You're an animation lecturer. For me, I was a music technology lecturer, and then after a while realized that actually I wasn't. I was a lecturer, and I could apply those skills in a range of different ways. So being able to have the confidence to let go of that will take some courage, but don't ever think that you haven't got a set of skills that are useful to people.
Yeah, definitely. And then that would be my final word, would simply be that it's a mindset shift, and mindset shifts can always feel like a death or a bereavement. And I want to really say something to people who I think, and I know this is true, I've met a lot of pre-bereaved academics who are their departments are being closed. I've spoken to 4 or 5 or 6 people in different places, all who have packed their stuff away in boxes because there's been a decision taken that their subject area is no longer viable. And that's an identity piece for that. And I know that feeling. I know when you've been told that your subject specialism, your expertise is no longer viable, no longer valued. And I certainly don't want to put this on the same footing and say, well, if that being true, you need to reframe and don't talk about your expertise. What I'm saying is that don't let anyone tell you that you weren't doing all the other things as well, and that all those other things have huge value, because if you take those things out, you just have expertise and no one's listening. And we've all sat in lectures and all met people who are amazing, but also struggling to give their expertise away and actually produce the transformations that we know learning and teaching is supposed to do in that respect. So I think that to sort of not see it as not being complicit in this shrink, I would say that is to actually walk into those skill sets and say, actually, I've been doing amazing, important and muscular work for the entire time, as well as being an extraordinary, interesting expert in a particular field. So that would be my sort of final word to you, really.
Yeah, to use the language of learning design, you've been both the subject matter expert with the disciplinary knowledge and the learning designer responsible for transmitting that knowledge. Now, you may have placed a lot more emphasis on the transmission of that, but really, I suppose, bringing it back to our forthcoming MA in creative teaching and learning design, this is why we feel that you need to look at the intersection of that. What is teaching and learning design? What is that intersection? Because if you're just blasting information at people, you might be teaching them, but you can certainly argue that that's probably not very effective if you're not thinking about subsequently the learning design around that content and how it's going to be received and what might get in the way of that. So this is why we absolutely believe that you have to think about these two things together.
And well, I know when I do that thing, and then 2 hours later the webinar finished, I will say that one of the key roles of a learning designer is to work with subject matter experts. In other words, that you work with people who do hold all the knowledge. Working with a subject matter expert is a delicate, empathic, nuanced job, because you're dealing with, when you deal with people's expertise, you're dealing with their identity, and you're dealing with their often their strong sense of the right way in which information or knowledge needs to be imparted. They're often gatekeepers in that sense. And if you have also been a gatekeeper, if you've also been a subject matter expert, if you've also fought to ensure that the rigor in your subject remains, if you've done that job, then you are again very well placed to consult around other subject matter experts, because you won't go in with your size 12 shoes and walk all over their ego, or clamber around, or you will be an excellent conduit between the learner and the expert. And that conduit, really building that conduit, is the sacred role of the learning designer, really, because you're trying to get information out and along to another human being in a way that changes that human being. That's all you're trying to do. And you would be surprised how much learning design isn't interested in that at all. Honestly, I mean, you'd be amazed how many educational experiences are not interested in bridging that gap at all. And that's where I think Tony and I do our most important and problematizing work. It's like we need to bring these two worlds closer together. You think you're together, you are miles apart.
Yeah, and where's the learner in this experience?
Yeah.
So if you would like to find out more about if you're watching this, thank you for making it to the end. And if you'd like to find out more about our forthcoming MA, there will be information forthcoming shortly. Obviously, it only happened this week. So if you would like to find out more, do get in touch with us on LinkedIn, and we will start to share information around that. And obviously, documentation and websites and enrollment information and all that will be forthcoming over the course of the summer. But in the meantime, if you'd just like to have a conversation with us about what leaving HE looks like, what your options might be, about what qualifications you might need or not need to do that job, then we're always happy to have a conversation. So do please get in touch with us.
Yeah, and enjoy your sandwich.
Yeah, enjoy your mayonnaise sandwich, and enjoy the rest of the summer. And and don't despair. I think just parting comment. Just take confidence in the fact that if you've been teaching for a long time, you've got more skills than perhaps you realise. Yeah,
and so if this old man can do it, and sort of then I mean, it was it's been a blast, really, right?
It's only just starting, really.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cheers, Phil. Talk soon.
All right, cheers, Tony.